Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome back. Tonight's guest speaker is Arvind Panjabi. Arvind is a senior research scientist at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies in Fort Collins, Colorado, where he works to conserve birds of Western North America through an integrated approach involving science, education, and land stewardship. Much of his career is focused on developing a scientific and social foundation to advance bird conservation in Latin America, especially in Mexico, where he has studied grassland birds since 2005 and currently coordinates a voluntary network of private conservation lands encompassing more than 600,000 acres in 3 states. Arvind has co-authored over 20 peer-reviewed articles on the ecology and conservation of birds, including a recent landmark report published in Science, and has worked closely with government, academic, and other partner organizations to coordinate and implement high-priority conservation actions for birds from Canada, all the way down to Panama. Please join me in welcoming Arvind Panjabi.
Figured out. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back here speaking with this group. I can't even remember quite when it was, but it was too long ago that I was last here sharing some of the work that I do at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies.
Hold on.
Yep.
Okay. You can get a little
Get
closer
a little
to this
closer?
and hold the microphone closer to me.
Okay, they're not hearing me through there though, right? Or
Closer to here is the
closer,
important
that's where we need the volume.
Yep.
I'll try to balance the two, so I don't blow your ears out in here. But it's great to be back, and inspiring to hear what Fort Collins Audubon is up to, and really what a great organization, getting people interested in birds and getting people out in nature.
You can step back. I'm going to bring this out to you.
Okay.
There.
Yeah, what an important role that is to get people familiar with nature and to know birds and to know the places in their own backyard that are so important to birds and other wildlife and nature in general. So and all volunteer run. So thank you for supporting Fort Collins Audubon. It reminds me that I need to renew my membership here as well. Yeah, a little bit of a depressing topic, but I hope to not make it too depressing. I hope to make it more interesting and to show you how a lot of the data that many of you have probably participated in collecting in one form or another helped inform this study, and what the response has been to this study that was pretty eye-opening for a lot of us. Yeah, so I'll just jump right in, I think. So by now, this is old news, right? We've lost 3 billion birds since 1970. I was going to say I wasn't going to mention this, but it's actually probably a lot more than 3 billion birds because we've underestimated many population sizes of birds, and so we probably had even more birds back then, and the declines that we've measured since then reflect probably an even greater decline. But let's go with 3 billion for now. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the paper itself and how we came up with this conclusion. So a little bit about the methods behind the study and some of the key results, the patterns of decline, because they're not uniform and they're rather interesting to think about. And also talk about some signs of hope. The report wasn't entirely bad news. There are some bright spots and some encouraging patterns. As well as, I think one of the biggest signs of hope has been the response from the conservation community on how do we bring these birds back, or how do we stop the decline. So that's, I'll talk a little bit about that. In particular, some of the new conservation initiatives and funding that have been spawned in part from the 3 billion birds article. And I'm going to have just a little bit of time to talk about some of the programs at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, things we do to help birds, and some of the conservation programs we have. Would gladly come back for another presentation and talk more about what we do, but I'm kind of trying to focus this a little bit on the bigger picture. And I will make sure to talk about as well all the ways that each of us in this room can help. In case you don't know who we are, the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, we are a nonprofit organization based in Colorado, founded in Colorado in 1988 as the Colorado Bird Observatory. We since grew over the years, although our mission has never changed, nor has the scope of our work. It's always been through the Rocky Mountain regions, down through Mexico and beyond, anywhere where birds from this region go during their life cycle. We work primarily through three avenues: through science, through land stewardship, and through education. Yeah. So this is why we're all here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to take a moment to marvel at this bird. It is perfectly created, right? And adapted to its environment. It does incredible things, travels incredible distances. I mean, and look at its beauty, the symmetry of its feathers, the size of the bird. It's tiny. And it accomplishes amazing things. So I'm gonna just, I gotta trigger this video here. Find the mouse. There we go. Just you can see a little bit about where this bird goes, right? It breeds up in the Pacific Northwest. First of all, who in here has seen a rufous hummingbird? Almost everybody. That's great. They are a pretty common sight in Colorado when they come through here during their fall migration, on their way back to their wintering grounds, which you can see it's a pretty small area in southwestern Mexico. As you can imagine, the concentration of birds there, and they have a fast spring migration back up to the Pacific Northwest, and then a more prolonged fall migration through the center of the continent, western continent. So an incredible bird, incredibly robust, that it can travel all this distance and survive, lives off of nectar. All it really needs is flowers. Yet this bird has suffered almost a 70% population decline just since 1970. And if any of you think the bird is getting more uncommon recently, you can see that just since 2011, we've lost another 28% of its population. So it is one of these birds that we call, it's at the tipping point of, in another few years, it could lose another 30%, or I'm sorry, another 50% of its population in about another 20 to 30 years on the current trajectory. So the big question is why, right? Why is a bird like this doesn't have to cross any oceans to migrate? It lives just about anywhere. Doesn't depend on old growth forests or any particular habitats like that. Why is a bird like this suffering such a loss? So I don't have an answer for you, but this bird is emblematic of many of the birds that we're losing. We have a good sense of what is happening to the environment in general and how it affects birds, but specifically for individual species, we're often at a loss to pinpoint what do we need to do to turn around the trend for rufous hummingbird. So we're going to go back in time a little bit. Many of you probably remember when this book first came out. It helped spark a revolution of sorts. It was some of the first awareness brought to our attention about bird declines in North America. And it helped spawn a very important program, namely the North American Breeding Bird Survey, that was started by Chandler Robbins back in 1966, with the first season of surveys being done in 1967. This is an entirely volunteer program that now spans entire United States and southern Canada. Also goes up into Alaska since the early 90s. Has been running up there. This program, which, like I said, is run by volunteers, has been essential for us to understand these patterns of change in our bird communities, and we've relied on it a lot in this paper. And this notion of birds declining is not anything new. In fact, we've known for a long time that most of our birds, many of our birds anyways, are declining. But one of the questions that led us to undertake this study was, if we take into account those species that are increasing as well as those that are decreasing, have we lost more birds, or have we lost birds compared to what we used to have back in 1970? So that was the impetus for our study, because we know many birds have increased. Robins, kingbirds. For every acre of forest that's been cleared, birds have come in and occupied that space. It's just been different species of birds. So this question has lingered over our head for a long time. So the first task to addressing this question was, how many birds are there? And how many birds are there today versus in times gone by? So we relied on some surveys that you're probably familiar with and probably have participated in to some degree. Anybody here run the breeding bird survey route? BBS? Yes, right. Yeah, it's a great program. Like I said, it gives us most of the trend information that we rely on for our birds. It's very standardized to eliminate sources of error and bias. Christmas bird count, how about that? How many people here participate in Christmas bird counts? Yeah, this is another great program that especially is helpful for filling in gaps on species that don't breed in the lower continental United States, but migrate down here in the winter. And so this is the time that we can count them. And we also relied on a number of other surveys, species-specific surveys, waterfowl surveys, and so forth, that are performed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service, and other entities that are focused primarily on individual species or small groups of species. So we compiled information on population sizes for 529 species of birds in North America. How many birds do we have in North America, roughly, in total? Around 700, right? But that includes a lot of marine species and some vagrant species, some species that just barely get into the United States. So this was a pretty large percentage of the overall breeding avifauna of North America. And these sources, these estimates of population size came from a variety of sources. The Breeding Bird Survey was a primary source for many of our songbird populations, as well as some of the water birds. Shorebirds, which breed in the high Arctic, need a different type of survey to count their populations. So we relied on surveys compiled by the U.S. Shorebird Conservation Plan, as well as surveys compiled by the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, and groups like the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna that put out reports on Arctic geese populations and other species that breed in the Arctic that are not waterfowl or hunted waterfowl, and other reports. And we took information on population trends, again, largely from the Breeding Bird Survey, smaller number of species from the Christmas bird count, shorebirds, a number of them were monitored through the shorebird migration surveys. And then again, some species-specific surveys for waterfowl, Arctic geese, and other groups of birds. Fortunately, we had a lot of this information already compiled, which made our job a lot easier, because this is information that we maintain at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies in the Partners in Flight Avian Conservation Assessment Database. So we had this information that we had been compiling and curating and updating for many years, and had it ready to go, but we had never actually combined the population size and the population trend data together to come up with estimates of total abundance and change in abundance. As you can see, there's other information we maintain in that database, and in total, it has information on these 7 parameters for over 1,600 species in North America, going down through Panama, and the conservation status assessment for each one. Again, that's the other part of my job at Bird Conservancy Rockies. I'd be happy to come back and talk about that sometime. But so we had this information. We did have to update some of it to get the most current trends, so forth, and put this information into we call a hierarchical model, population change. And from there, we generated the biome and other taxonomic group level results for the report. But we also didn't want to rely just on the survey data. We wanted a completely independent source of information to corroborate the trend data that we were analyzing. So we turned to weather radar, which is also not an unfamiliar tool. It's been used for a number of decades now to study bird migration. And birds give off a unique reflectivity signal, particularly with the Doppler weather radar, which has the ability to measure the size of the objects aloft in the air. And the birds give a unique signal that allows us to determine what are birds versus what are other atmospheric noise, like rain or insects or even bats, based on their behaviors. And yeah, each one of these blossoms that you see appearing there is birds aloft at night. And so we were able to gather data from Doppler weather radar stations across the United States to analyze the cumulative biomass aloft during the spring migration. And we focused on spring because of the shorter period of time, fall migration can be more drawn out. And so we used just the spring migration data. And you can see the areas of white are the areas of heavier migration traffic. And so from this, we were able to estimate volume of birds aloft. Nope. I guess I didn't. Oh no, we'll get there later. So that was our independent source to verify our trend data. Now the results of the study are pretty well known. From the survey data, we estimated a combined loss of nearly 3 billion birds across the 500 plus species since 1970, which was roughly a 29% loss of total abundance of birds in North America, nearly a third of all birds. And more than half the species are in decline, with statistically significant declines from the survey data. Now the radar data, here you see circles in red indicate radar stations that showed declines. Those circles in blue showed increases over the period. The hollow circles were not statistically significant. So when we look at what areas had significant changes in bird population, we found that the eastern and central United States in particular showed significant losses in bird populations aloft during spring migration. So when we combine those trends in the patterns aloft with the estimates of biomass passage, we could estimate where the losses have occurred primarily, and we see that they're mostly centered over the Great Plains or the Eastern Great Plains and sort of the Midwest area of the United States, basically the Corn Belt. And so the Mississippi and the Atlantic flyways were the only two areas that had showed significant declines in biomass aloft during spring migration. And this equated to roughly a 13.6% loss since 2007, which was very similar to the rates of loss we saw in the survey data, an annual rate of decline of roughly 1.5%. And now when going back to the survey data, we can break down, of course, I should say the radar data, we can't tell which species those are. But one thing, I'll go back to the slide, one thing we do know is that the birds that migrate through this region are the birds that are primarily moving up into the boreal forest. Right, these are the ones they fly over eastern North America and then begin to fan out west and occupy the rest of the boreal forest. But this is their migration corridor. So those are the species that we believe are showing these steep trends, negative trends through the radar data. When we look at the survey data, we see a slightly different picture, but some of it corroborated again. Grassland birds, unsurprisingly, is the group of birds that has lost the greatest proportion of their total population. But there are other birds as well that are showing steep declines. Shorebirds as a group, boreal forest birds, those are the ones that are being picked up by the radars in particular, and even western forest birds, birds we think of as living largely on National Forest Service lands and other public lands. These birds are also showing nearly a third population loss since 1970. So grassland birds, we're gonna focus a little bit on grassland birds. Colorado is an important state for grasslands. Our whole eastern half of our states has some of the best grasslands remaining in the lower 48 states, and very important for a number of species, including our state bird, the lark bunting. But sadly, grassland birds have suffered a 53% loss, and that's continent-wide. If we were to look at birds in just the Great Plains, it would probably be even larger than that. And in total, 720 million birds, we estimate, have been lost from that system. Boreal forest birds, nearly 500 million from just that system alone. Now, here's the bright spot. And it's a small one, but it's an important one. Wetlands. So we've seen an increase in wetland-dependent birds. Roughly 13%, or a 20 million bird gain over these 50 years. But that's not insignificant because we know how threatened wetlands were and still are, and how much effort has gone into protecting them and restoring them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But that was the only biome out of all the biomes that were analyzed through the birds that showed an increase over this 50-year period. When we break it down taxonomically, we see some other interesting patterns. Let's start with the birds lost. I guess not surprisingly that the largest proportion of those birds lost are sparrows. And some of us may think of sparrows as these drab, hard to identify birds, but they're actually some of the most beautiful and iconic birds of North America. Each one representing a unique landscape, like our sagebrush ecosystems, or our grasslands, or our foothill shrublands, or the desert shrublands, or mountain parks. Their songs are also extremely beautiful. So more than a quarter of those birds lost were these North American sparrows, and North America is the epicenter of sparrow diversity in the world. And not to be confused with the old world sparrows, which you see on the bottom left there. This is essentially one species, the house sparrow, that also made up a significant portion of the birds lost. But beyond the sparrows, we see wood warblers make up a significant portion. And surprisingly, blackbirds, birds that we still think of very common and see them in large numbers. Again, one of the groups that showed one of the largest declines. And beyond that, we see the rest of maybe a third of the birds in total spread out between a number of bird families. When we look at the birds that gain population, again, a very interesting pattern. What is going on with vireos? Okay. Vireos are forest birds, generally forest or shrubland birds. They depend on native habitats. They don't tend to be generalists. They're habitat specialists. Just like many of the wood warblers, often seen in the same company, same flocks. Yet these birds are doing well. All species of vireos have either stable or increasing populations since 1970 in North America. And I will personally reward anyone who can tell me why. But there's some theories that could be thrown out there. I mean, they do have a little bit of a broader foraging niche. Maybe that offers them some advantages, that they're a little more flexible in what they eat. But they generally tend to be found in the same habitat. So an interesting conundrum, but also perhaps a sign of hope that not all is lost. Ducks and geese, another group of birds that showed significant population increases. Raptors, another group that maybe not surprisingly since 1970 has shown a population increase thanks to the removal of DDT. Turkeys and grouse, well, anyone who lives in Fort Collins knows that turkeys are increasing here, just like they've been doing in the east and in other places for a number of decades now. And then, yeah, quite a number of other families as well, showing some increases. Gnatcatchers is another surprising one. Again, this is mostly the blue-gray gnatcatcher that is showing a significant population increase. It's the most numerous gnatcatcher. So a few bright spots there, but also a lot of bad news. And here's a red-eyed vireo. This is a species that migrates all the way to South America, and so it has a long migration, but it is increasing and adapting to our changing world quite well. Surprisingly, 50% of the loss that we measured is made up of 10 very common species, birds that we see in our backyards and in our nearby environments across the continent. And birds like the horned lark, the dark-eyed junco, savanna sparrow, even the red-winged blackbird, which many of us may love to hate when they come and drain the bird feeders, but these birds are declining steeply. And as I mentioned before, these non-native species that arrived to North America in the last century, 100 years ago or more, and have since been taking off, well, now they have been coming back down. And all three of these common, widespread, non-native bird species are showing steep declines. So again, we got to ask ourselves why. So why does this matter? I don't think I need to convince this group here why this matters, right? We all love birds, but this is a warning, right? Species decline before they go extinct. So we're also losing ecosystem integrity, right? These birds play important roles in the ecosystem, whether they're to control insects or to disperse seeds or to pollinate plants, or to feed other species. And so when one species starts to decline in an ecosystem, the other species that depend on that either decline as well, or they adapt and have to switch. And what we see sometimes, especially related to climate and changes in climate, is that when one species goes away, a bird or a predator that used to rely on that species will now have to start eating another species. And so it could start changing the predator-prey dynamics within the whole avian community and the whole animal and vertebrate community. We're also losing the opportunity to experience birds and see birds, right? Sure, some of us probably remember when the phrase "a bird in every bush" was actually a reality. You could step out the door during migration and you'd see birds everywhere. We're losing that opportunity. And we're losing the opportunity to witness the spectacle of migration, which is really quite a phenomenon. And with that comes this shifting baseline syndrome, where people today, they don't know birds. They've never seen a bird up close, perhaps. And that's because there's fewer of them. And they don't realize that a walk in the woods in spring, when it seems abnormally quiet, is something unusual. But that's something else to be concerned with, because as we lose these birds and as we all age and get older, it might be easy to forget that there ever were birds. So these birds truly are the canary in the coal mine, both for us and for other species as well. If these common birds can't survive and thrive in our environment, eventually that's going to catch up with us. So we really need to focus here, not just on protecting species that are at risk of extinction, but keeping common birds common. Now, the drivers of these declines, I think, are pretty well familiar with us. We know what some of the big ones are, right? Loss of native habitat, the farmland expansion and urban sprawl and deforestation, especially in the tropics. These are still major contributors to direct habitat loss for birds, and probably some of the most important things to not lose sight of. But we have other factors as well: agrochemicals, climate change, and human-induced mortality. These are all on top of that habitat loss and are additional contributing factors, yet many of them are much less understood. One of them that is starting to be more understood is the effects of specific human-induced mortality, what we talk about. Things that are caused because of our built environment and the direct human impact. So the biggest one being cats, right? 2.4 billion birds estimated to be killed by free-ranging cats. This includes both our backyard cats as well as feral cats. But it's by far the biggest contributor to population loss that we can imagine. Next after that comes collisions with buildings and windows in particular. More than a quarter of that 1 billion birds attributable to window death each year come from windows on houses. So they're not the skyscrapers, but there are houses in our backyards. And well below those two factors are things like collisions with power lines, and even less so collisions with towers and wind turbines, which make up a much smaller part. That 6.6 million there includes wind turbines and other stationary towers that birds do collide with, but in comparison, they pale to the impact overall on populations. Now you might be asking, wait a minute, we lost 3 billion birds over 50 years and we're losing 3 billion birds plus a year here. How does that work mathematically? Well, keep in mind the 3 billion birds lost that we measured was to breeding populations, right? So we estimate there's about 10 billion breeding birds in North America each year. Each year that number more than doubles when those birds reproduce and have offspring. In fact, it may be as many as 4 times as high as that. So the birds that are lost are maybe considered surplus birds, but they're also birds that would have been recruited into the population or already were part of that population. So these numbers here pertain to the total population, not just the breeding population. So birds face a number of threats. Because birds migrate, they may face many different threats along along their travels and throughout their life cycle. And these threats are exacerbated by things like climate change. You can imagine birds trying to cross the Gulf of Mexico, small birds during a hurricane, and how many are lost, as well as how many birds have lost their territories, their breeding sites due to all the fires that we had last year. These are big changes that we haven't experienced before. So, are there reasons for hope in all this bad news? I think there are. Certainly we know bird populations are resilient, and that when we pinpoint the cause of a decline, we can tackle it and we can address it. And the bald eagle is a perfect example of that. When we determined that it was DDT that was causing eggshell thinning and low reproductive success and the population decline, once we banned DDT, we saw an incredible resurgence of the bald eagle population, and birds like the peregrine falcon benefited as well, have made a comeback, as have birds like the California condor, once on the brink of extinction, now has far many more free-roaming individuals than at any point during the last 100 years. The Kirtland's warbler is another example, one of the rarest warblers in North America, Was on the endangered species list for many years, now been downlisted, and has recovered quite well. And again, we have more Kirtland's warblers than we ever had at any point in the last 100 years. So perhaps the best example of successful conservation in action, though, is the waterfowl example. Hunters raised their voices and money for waterfowl conservation when they were concerned about population declines, enacted legislation, and developed funding streams to protect and manage wetlands. And now waterfowl populations are up by 55% continentally. So the question is, how do we replicate these successes for other birds? And well, this 3 billion birds paper really brought about a moment of time for conservation, where the whole world's attention was turned onto this loss of birds. And the article generated an incredible response in the media. More than 1,700 news outlets picked up this news and shared it. It reached almost 4 billion people in the first few weeks and months after the report came out. And it generated a lot of interest and concern, and most of the reporting was very accurate and positive. So there's been a tremendous response from the public and an awakening. So how has the conservation community responded to this? Well, there's fortunately been a few new conservation initiatives that have come about in part due to this report. Some of them were already starting just prior to the release of this report, and the report has really helped catalyze those and bring more attention and resources to those initiatives. So I'm going to mention a few of them here. I'm definitely not including everything. I'm thinking more nationally. I'm thinking more about some of the stuff in our region as well. There probably are other efforts elsewhere in the country that I'm not accurately covering here. I'm going to mention a few of these. One of these is the Grasslands Roadmap, and that's an initiative that Bird Conservancy of the Rockies has been spearheading. I'm going to get into that a little more here. Another is the JV8, as we call it, rather esoteric term, but JV stands for the Joint Ventures, which are a network of partnerships set up by the Fish and Wildlife Service across North America to bring together public and private partners who are working on bird conservation to better coordinate and leverage their work and keep track of what they're doing, and to be able to track and report on progress from the whole conservation partnerships in different regions of the country. So now the JV8 are 8 joint ventures located largely in this central grasslands region of North America, which you can see in the map there, that are now for the first time starting to work across their boundaries with each other on coordinating migratory bird conservation through that region of the central grasslands. One effort that I've been involved with the last few years is the Chihuahuan Grassland Conservation Investment Strategy. This is an effort to bring more attention and resources to grasslands on the southern end of the migratory life cycle for these birds that migrate between the Great Plains and the Chihuahuan Desert, which is most of our grassland birds of the Great Plains. They don't go very far, they just go down into northern Mexico. And so we're working on a strategy, a roadmap of sorts for funders and conservation investors to understand better how we can achieve gains in bird populations, grassland bird populations, in 17 different priority areas of the Chihuahuan Desert in northern Mexico and the southwestern US. There's through all the momentum going now around grasslands, we've managed to get an international year of rangelands and pastoralists elevated in the United Nations, and it's going to be an international year recognizing rangelands and grasslands across the world and people who live in them and the biodiversity that they support. So this is going to be in 2026. There's a number of things that Bird Conservancy of the Rockies has been doing and is continuing to do, and we're gonna get into those here in a little bit as well. Some of these other initiatives you may have heard of, America the Beautiful. Anybody familiar with that one? So this was an initiative of the Biden administration that they're pledged to help meet the global 30 by 30 goal, which is to protect 30% of the world's lands and waters by 2030. And then Canada has implemented a new initiative, started just a couple of years ago after the 3 billion birds, called their Priority Places Initiative. And they have 11 priority regions in Canada where they're making investments in land conservation. And their goal is to protect 25% of Canada's land and waters by 2025. And then the ornithological community in particular, some of the authors from the 3 Billion Birds paper have launched a Road to Recovery initiative, which is aimed at identifying those limiting factors for some of our most deeply, rapidly declining bird species. So I'm going to talk mostly about these two programs, just in the limited time I have here. So let's see, we'll start with the Grasslands Roadmap. This is really a pretty inspiring story, I think. And I want to give a shout out to our director, Tammy Bercotteren. She single-handedly has led and coordinated this massive effort across 3 countries and involved more than 200 different partner organizations. And she's done all this on the side of leading the organization and being director here. Am I good distance-wise here? Yeah, good, okay. So shout out to Tammy for her efforts on leading this and to finally being able to hire a full-time coordinator to help keep this initiative going. So what the Grasslands Roadmap is, it's a multinational initiative to save our grasslands. And to do it in a different way, to implement conservation in a different way than has been done in the past. Hopefully not repeat mistakes of the past, and to learn from them and how we can improve conservation going forward to have a better impact. So some of the priorities of the Grassland Roadmap include elevating voices that have traditionally been left out of conservation efforts in North America. Advancing road to recovery science to identify limiting factors, but also incorporating traditional ecological knowledge where appropriate. And so the roadmap is somewhat of a figurative term. It's not actually a map to follow, but there are several layers to this. So part of the goal is to create a new bold new policy agenda. And much of the work is unified messaging around bringing back 3 billion birds and improved coordination amongst all these partners and communication. So the roadmap has involved 7 different sectors, as well as indigenous nations throughout the 3 countries to improve our coordination and collaboration and increase our efforts together for grasslands conservation in the Central Grasslands region, which basically encompasses the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert region of Mexico and all the way up into Canada. So, as mentioned in the past, many times our approaches would focus on birds, suites of birds or individual species, but largely birds, not including necessarily the human dimension element of bird conservation. And we know that birds don't just conserve themselves. People need to conserve birds and conserve habitat for birds. So one of the things that the roadmap is attempting to do here is to not only protect core grassland areas, protect important areas within those grasslands that are particularly important for some of the highest priority species of birds that are declining most rapidly, and then also identifying where we have the community will to implement different kinds of conservation solutions. Partners from the roadmap, in particular, University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and World Wildlife Fund have put together this map that shows where the remaining grasslands exist in North America. The core areas are the areas in green. Vulnerable grasslands are those that are highly fragmented with croplands or have high levels of encroachment from trees or shrubs. And then the purple areas are the already converted grasslands. So you can see there's a fair bit of grasslands still in Wyoming, Nebraska, a bit in South Dakota, a lot of it getting pretty fragmented, North Dakota, Montana. Still some core grasslands there, all the way down through Colorado and New Mexico. And notice down in Mexico, we have a very different situation there. Most of that southern region is already occupied by desert shrub. The grassland core areas are quite small, and there is a high degree of fragmentation in this part of the system. So a lot of the messaging and initiatives that are part of the grassland roadmap are focused on supporting and growing this core of grasslands. As I mentioned, we need to take into account the social landscape in addition to the ecological landscape, and avoid repeating errors of the past. So one of the particular focuses of the grassland roadmap has been to include indigenous voices and indigenous partners from throughout the region. And again, commend Tammy Vercotteren for her efforts in bringing these people to the table. So we're creating maps to help direct conservation at a high level, maps that can be shared across agencies, across countries, and different partners that show not only where we have the core grasslands, but where we have the cultural will, where we have, for example, Indian reservations, which for grassland birds, these are some of the largest intact grasslands, particularly in the more eastern parts of the Great Plains that have already been converted. Now we have to look at capacity, where we have capacity on the ground, where we need to add capacity, where we have opportunities, and we'll soon be working to add the ecological data to this map as well to overlay areas that are particularly important for some of our high priority bird species like chestnut collared longspur and Sprague's pipit and others. In addition to efforts like the Grassland Roadmap, which, like I said, involve many partners across many different organizations, now I'd like to switch gears a little bit and just highlight some of the work that Bird Conservancy of the Rockies is doing, particularly related to grasslands. One of our programs, the stewardship program, is aimed at helping landowners be good stewards of the land and to protect and enhance habitat for birds. We have what we call 15 partner biologists, or these are wildlife habitat biologists that are co-located with other organizations, agencies like the Natural Resources Conservation Service, as well as state wildlife agencies, that are based on a hybrid funding model with some money coming from the state, some money coming from private sources that we bring to the table. But these are Bird Conservancy of the Rockies employees that are located in these government offices and drive government vehicles, but they are, like I said, Bird Conservancy employees. And so it reduces the cost of these positions so we can have more biologists out on the ground working with partners. And they have access through these agencies to major funding, particularly the Farm Bill. And you know, there's billions of dollars in the Farm Bill, millions, hundreds of millions going to conservation programs. And so our biologists that are in these offices use those money to do bird-friendly projects with private landowners, especially grazing projects, improving grazing systems so that areas can rest more, recover, and support both birds and livestock. So who's at the table here? A number of different organizations. I mentioned NRCS, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, A number of state agencies in our region contribute to this, and as well as a number of foundations and private organizations like the joint ventures. So it's a bit of a new model for conservation. I've seen it now replicated by other organizations across the country as well. So it's a model that has been adopted by others, and is making a difference. Here's an example of one project that was done in Dawson County, Montana. It was restoring some cropland back to native cover. So not a cheap project, not something that a landowner is just going to do on their own because they want to do the right thing. This costs a lot of money and takes a lot of effort. So it's a $1.5 million project to reseed about 4,200 acres back to grassland. It also included some funding for fencing and livestock water development so that they could use the land for grazing. And it's basically a win-win-win situation for the ecosystem, for the producer, and for grassland birds. And collectively, across those 15 positions, those biologists are impacting more than 300,000 acres annually in implementing farm bill programs, in particular, to do that. I'm going to switch gears a little bit to some of the work in Mexico. This is the work that I personally oversee and started about 12 years ago. It goes back longer than that, doing research and monitoring in the region. But after studying grassland birds in the region for about 10 years and seeing the habitat being destroyed at such a rapid rate, an unprecedented rate, because it had not been occurring there really prior to 2005 much at all. I decided to shift gears and focus on this voluntary conservation program that we started working with one landowner, then got his brother on board, and we had two landowners, then it was a program. And now, some 12 years later, we have 36 landowner partners involved, covering 660,000 acres. With each of these landowners, we signed a 15-year protection agreement for their property. It's not permanent protection, but again, we're not paying them for this. They're doing this voluntarily as we help them transition their grazing practices to more sustainable techniques. And so we help provide the cost share to implement projects that they need to do to be able to rotate their cattle and allow areas to rest and recover, which is good for birds and good for the ecosystem. But many of these ranches in Mexico are huge. As you can imagine, 36 ranches covering 660,000 acres. You do the math there, it's roughly around 20,000 acres per ranch. And many of these pastures are huge, enormous. 5,000, 10,000 acre pasture is not uncommon on some of these big ranches. So how do you manage cattle across that area? And what traditionally has been done is ranchers would put the watering sources where the best forage was, because that's where the most productive part of the ranch was. But those areas became impacted, overgrazed. So a newer method of grazing that has shown great promise and success, and some of the people who've been doing it, especially in northern Mexico, is these high intensity, short duration rotational grazing, where they move the cow through at a pretty high density, but for a very short time, and then allow those areas to rest for between 1 to 2 years before the cows come back to that area. You can imagine the infrastructure it takes on a 20,000 acre ranch to rotate your cattle through each day to a different pasture, where then they come back around 2 years later to graze some piece of ground. Most of that is done with temporary fence. So it doesn't have a permanent impact on the land, but water is key to being able to rotate cattle, right? So you need to have water distributed throughout the ranch, and that is one of the biggest challenges that the ranchers face in trying to implement these types of grazing practices. So that's what we help with. And the landowners step up as well. We provide 50% of the funding for these projects, they provide the other 50%. And prior to doing those types of projects, we develop a range management plan and a wildlife management plan for their property. and integrate those two and have objectives for both rangeland improvements and habitat improvements. And then we work with the landowners on implementing projects to meet those goals. And we conduct bird and vegetation monitoring on all properties to not only measure the number of birds that we're impacting through the work, but to understand whether the impact is helping. Are we seeing positive responses in the bird populations there? This map on the left here shows where the ranches in the Sustainable Grazing Network are located by county in Chihuahua. Primarily, that's the state there just southwest of the Texas Big Bend area. We also do have one ranch over in Sonora that we're working with, and a large ranch in Coahuila in the east that we're working with. But most of our work right now is in Chihuahua. We would like to expand, but most of our capacity is based in Chihuahua City right now. So again, trying to avoid errors of the past and create landscapes that look like what you see on the left side of the fence here, which has clearly been overgrazed for years and has contributed to the shrubs encroaching on that site, which has changed it from a grassland to a shrubland. Whereas you can see on the right-hand side of the fence, they've had a very different grazing scheme, probably a much more conservative one over the years. And we don't see the problems of shrub encroachment there as severely. The ranch on the right here is another ranch in Chihuahua. It's a little, I don't know if my pointer is working here. Yeah, you can see these are some pronghorn there. These are Mexican pronghorn, a highly endangered subspecies of the pronghorn, only about 300 remaining in Mexico. And this nest platform here you see is for an aplomado falcon, which is also a very highly endangered population that's remaining now in the Chihuahuan Desert in Chihuahua, in one area of Chihuahua, the Valle Centrales region. Used to be a population that was found up into Arizona and Texas and New Mexico, and they still wander from there up into these areas, but they haven't bred successfully in the southwestern US since the 1940s. But so many of the partners we work with on this program have aplomado falcons and have the majority of the aplomado falcons that are left on their ranches. There's a few people who we aren't able to get on board with the program who do have a few of these pairs of birds. We estimate there's less than 15 pairs of these birds remaining. And so in addition to grazing management, we try to restore grassland habitats. One of the biggest issues, long-term issues for the grasslands in this part of the world has been shrub encroachment, desertification, again, resulting from long-term overgrazing and suppression of fire that came along with the overgrazing. Because once you graze away the fine fuels, there's nothing left to burn when a lightning strike happens. So we've done some mechanical shrub control treatments there, where we go in with a bulldozer and physically remove the shrubs. And you can see we've had some success recovering grasslands and grassland birds. It's a bit of an experimental technique. We're learning from it and working to improve it over time. But as we've learned from our research, shrubs have a very strong impact on grassland birds, both from a presence and abundance standpoint. Most grassland birds avoid areas with shrubs, at least the ones that we're most concerned about, the ones like Sprague's pipits, Barred sparrows, chestnut collared longspurs, and so forth, the mountain plovers. They tend to avoid shrubs. And we've also found from our research that shrubs bring in additional predators to the area that wouldn't be there otherwise, native predators, but nonetheless, they wouldn't be in an open grassland because they don't have nest sites, they don't have perch sites, and they prey heavily on the grassland songbirds and can increase mortality during the winter. So in general, we think trying to restore grasslands to a more shrub-free state is going to improve habitat quality for grassland birds on wintering grounds. And so we devote a fair bit of effort to that, but like I said, it's a Nobody has ever done this before, really. There's a few examples. Most of the shrub control that's done in the southwestern United States in this ecosystem is done by plane using chemicals. But our rancher partners don't want that down there. So we do it in a more old-fashioned way. A few examples of or a few metrics here. I don't know what happened to the lines in this image here, but yeah, so out of those 36 ranch partners so far, we've completed 22 of the ranch management plans. They take a few years to develop because we need to collect data over a few years to accurately measure things like forage capacity, as well as the grassland birds on the properties. Another technique that we implement is called keyline plowing. This is to improve the soil condition. A lot of the soils in the Chihuahuan Desert have been compacted by years of overgrazing, and then from a lack of vegetation. So you have these hard pan soils, and when it rains, the water just runs right off these areas and nothing penetrates there, nothing grows there. But if you go in and using the contours of the land, create these narrow, shallow furrows, that helps trap, it breaks up the soil, allows water to infiltrate, and it also traps seed from the surrounding landscape. And then those areas start to turn into these green strips that eventually grow out and start occupying the land. We don't do a lot of these other types of efforts like the gabions, but this is to slow water flow in gullies and reduce erosion and loss of topsoil. They are extremely effective, but they're also very expensive. And we've treated actually, yeah, a little over 5,000 acres using mechanical shrub control to remove shrubs from the landscape.
Are you saying you fill in the gullies?
Yeah, well, so behind here, if you imagine the water flowing in from the left, it slows down the water flow. Some of the sediment falls out here, and then of course some water goes over as well. But it does slow that water flow, allows more water to penetrate into the sides, doesn't further exacerbate the erosion, allows vegetation to start to take hold. And in fact, in places where I've seen this done, they've actually been able to return perennial stream flows to the surface of the land where they've been gone for years. So it actually raises the water table up in those areas. And you can imagine the vegetation response and the bird response as well to those types of enhancements.
I also asked what predators are attracted to shrubs? Are we talking about mammals or other birds?
Yeah, good question. So the question was, what predators are attracted to the shrubs? I should have mentioned that because that's an important one. The number one predator, the loggerhead shrike. And they are voracious predators on these small songbirds. And of course, they're a native species, one that needs some shrubs to live. They don't live in just open grasslands with no shrubs. They need the shrubs for nesting. They need the shrubs for hanging their food caches, their larders, that you know how they hunt other birds and small mammals, reptiles, insects, and then they hang them up around in their territory to display how successful they are. So without those shrubs, they wouldn't be there. And we found through our analyses that shrubs, especially taller shrubs, are the most important element for those birds.
So the landowner has to kick in money or other resources. What's in it for them?
What's in it for
What's their
them?
financial return.
Well, so for the grazing infrastructure, you can imagine the financial return is in healthier cattle, heavier cattle, that when they go to sell them, right? So they get more money. They're paid by the pound for their cattle. And higher birth rates with healthier grasslands, the cattle are healthier and have higher birth rates. So they don't need to supplement feed. They don't have as many problems with illness. So the cattle are healthier and more productive.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And even with the restoration programs, the shrub removal, the landowners are helping there as well because it's improving their pasture lands for their cattle. So it's a win-win. Let's see. I think we're about at the end here. clicker stopped working. Wanna give me a hand there, John? I think I'm just about at the end, so I know I'm about out of time too. And hopefully we'll have some time for questions. Yeah, so here's the infrastructure side of things, right? A lot of investments in infrastructure. One of our main goals is to keep these ranchers on the land. What we don't want to happen is for their productivity to fall so low where they're looking at having to sell their land to feed their family. So we've done a lot of fencing projects to allow that, again, rotational grazing, solar pumps for that water storage so they can pump shallow groundwater to fill their water tanks and water their cattle and distribute it throughout the ranch. They need those water lines distributed to distribute the water. These are not cheap. They cost, yeah, I don't have the price off the top of my head, but it's one of the main investments we make is in this type of buried water line. Of course, they do the burying. We purchase the material. And the guy pretty busy building these tanks. They tend to build them up on the tops of the hills where they can then distribute the water by gravity across the ranch. And then these mobile drinkers, watering troughs that they can move around. Again, that's where the cattle go to get their water. Again, trying to keep ranchers on the land. I mentioned also some of the simple solutions we do specifically for birds on these properties. We've installed more than 70 of these protective nest cribs for Apalmato falcons, both in active territories as well as in suitable areas. And the birds have much higher success rates nesting in these because it keeps out the great horned owls. We've installed over 200 stock tank ladders. These ladders tend to go in those big water storage tanks, not so much the small watering troughs, but that's where birds come in to drink. And interestingly enough, the birds don't use them to escape from the water because they don't fall in when they have a ladder. They use the ladder to safely access the water and drink. And then we also, whenever we find them, cap these open pipes, which you've probably heard about. Other types of birds like flycatchers and bluebirds and owls and hole nesting birds tend to go into these open pipes and get trapped in them. So we close those up to avoid and reduce human-induced mortality. Oh shoot, I'm almost out of time, and here I'm just getting to the part. I'll try to go through this quickly because this is really the important stuff. This is what has happened as a result of the roadmap. We've seen huge increases in investments in conservation and engagement by groups like the National Resources Conservation Service, which has recently committed $500 million to their Great Plains Framework. This is money that's going to go for easements and for habitat restoration and to support sustainable grazing. Major increase in investment by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, one of our biggest foundations working in the central grasslands region. They're now up to around $35 to $40 million in investment going out to conservation partners, everyone from NGOs like us to state agencies, the TNC and other groups like that, again, for habitat protection and management. And they're finally opening their doors and program to Mexico, which for many years has been off limits foundation. I mentioned the America is Beautiful program. 2 years ago, the grants awarded were 141 million in total, again, going to conservation projects, easements, land protection and restoration, as well as conservation planning. The Road to Recovery effort that I mentioned, the one that's aimed at identifying those limiting factors, pretty small by comparison, but it's the first fund we have dedicated to targeted research to identify those limiting factors. Some other initiatives, Restore New Mexico is a grassland program run by BLM New Mexico. They recently got $1 million from the Inflation Reduction Act to do grassland restoration on public lands. And the Canada's Priority Places. In 2022, they invested $2.3 billion in protecting lands in Canada. Oof. Oh boy. I don't want to take too much time here, but I think many of you know here what we need to do, right? You know, we need to make our voices heard. Let people know that birds matter to us and that we're concerned about what's happening. So 45 million bird watchers in the United States alone, contributing 41 billion annually. I think we deserve a voice. And there is some important pending legislation right now in Congress that we need to let our legislators know that this is important stuff we want to see happen. Biggest one of these is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. $4.1 billion on the table for non-game species conservation that would be distributed to the states. This initiative was very close to passing. It has a number of both Republican and Democratic co-sponsors. It did not pass in 2023, but it's certain to come back. That's perhaps the top priority. This other one, Migratory Birds of the Americas Conservation Enhancement Act, that would have increased funding for the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act from $5 million annually to $10 million annually. That's funding that goes largely south of our borders for bird conservation projects. The Bird Safe Windows Act failed to pass for a couple of years, but it's still being debated and still active legislation as of 2023. And then the Albatross and Petrel Conservation Act 2021. This would authorize the Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service to protect albatrosses and petrels in the open ocean, prohibit unauthorized taking, and facilitate and participate in international cooperation. So please don't stay silent on these issues. And I know Audubon in particular is really great at encouraging members to be active. We know about some of the things. We know we need to make our windows safer. These are things that we can all do in our own homes, in our workplaces. We need to make windows safer. There are several cheap options out there for doing this. You can find them online, but they make a difference. I've implemented both of these types of systems in my house, and I have hundreds of birds that gather at my bird feeders, and I have almost no bird death. Gone from several a year to less than one per year. Keeping cats indoors. I won't go on about this too much. We know how important this is. There are options. The most important thing is when you get a new cat, don't start letting them outside right away, right? Because it's only harder after that. There are places where these feral cat colonies have literally created bird-free dead zones. And you know, what's good for cats, what's good for the birds is good for the cats too. I have 2 cats that I love, and I keep them indoors. They are happy, they are old, and they do not kill birds. And they have no interest in going outside. Here's another one that we know we need to do: reduce our lawns, increase the number of native flowering and fruiting shrubs and trees in our yard. Birds that have access to these plants are more successful, they're more abundant, and they can thrive, and we can help support birds in our own backyards, especially during migration, which is a critical time, and create healthy green spaces in our cities, simply by using natives. Avoiding pesticides. I don't think I need to say too much about this. Of course, around the yard, we should also minimize our pesticide use, and there's really no need to apply pesticides. There are other ways to deal with pests, and support local agriculture. Also supporting shade-grown coffee. We don't realize it because we don't see it every day, but the birds that migrate here, many of them spend their time in shade coffee plantations in the winter. So buying shade-grown coffee, it's a little more expensive. It's just as good, if not better, than any other coffee you'll find on the market, and you are supporting migratory birds and resident birds. Yeah, question in the back. What kind of coffee? Yeah. There are several different brands, but you can look for this symbol. There are a lot of different kind of certifications out there, but this is the best one that truly supports bird-friendly coffee plantations, the Smithsonian. So Birds and Beans is one company that is certified by Smithsonian, but there are others as well. Reduce our use of plastics. And again, I don't think I need to emphasize this too much. We know that particularly for marine birds, plastics are fatal. They don't know what they are, so they eat them, and they die. So we need to stop using these plastics and tell our favorite restaurants when we go to get takeout that, hey, do you know there are alternatives to styrofoam plastic? And I would sure like to come back here more if you use those types of products. And hopefully many of you are doing this already, but those bird sightings you all are making each day, if you put them into eBird, they will be used by scientists like myself to study and direct bird conservation across the world, but we use them especially throughout the Americas. And finally, the last thing that everyone can do here as well is to support local conservation organizations like Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, like Fort Collins Audubon, like National Audubon Society, and many others. There are lots of different opportunities out there, but these are the workers who are on the front lines of conservation and implementing programs that are making a difference for birds. So for that, I'd like to recognize my co-authors on the manuscript and the various institutions, as well as the folks here who provided photos for this presentation. So thank you very much, and hope you
Thank you. All right, folks, I got him started late, that's on me, but I think we have time for maybe 10 minutes of questions. Before we get into that, just a plug for next month. Our program next month will be second Thursday, March 14th. And Dolly Edwards from Audubon of the Rockies will be talking about sagebrush country, what the future will look like for the West iconic ecosystem. So hope to see you on March 14th, but I'm going to give as much time as we can squeeze here before 9 o'clock for Q&A with Arvind. Arvind, it helps if you repeat the question for the people on Zoom.
do that. Yeah.
On the 3 billion bird law, that 3 billion breeding birds.
That's right. Yeah, the question there.
Was an annual one.
No, that's a cumulative loss.
Was it a cumulative law?
Cumulative loss. So the question was the 3 billion birds, if that was an annual loss or a cumulative loss, and from which segment of the population. And it represents a cumulative loss from the breeding populations of birds. And they mentioned the breeding population.
For the year, for an annual cycle?
No.
For the 40.
For the
50
50 years almost of the study, the breeding populations of birds have declined by nearly a third, losing almost 3 billion birds from the breeding population. Now,
from annual to annual.
no, that's from the combined population. So back in 1970, we had around 13 billion birds, and today we have about 10 billion breeding birds.
It's an annual.
No, it's a cumulative loss. Cumulative loss. And the other sources of human-induced mortality that I was talking about, the 2.4 billion birds killed by cats each year, the 1 billion birds killed by towers or killed by buildings and windows, those are annual losses from the total bird population, which is much larger than just the breeding population.
Okay, so I understand it, but what I'm just saying is, so now there's only 10 billion birds breeding versus 13 billion birds breeding back then.
Right.
Right.
That's correct. Yeah, so we're down. Yeah. Over there on the end. I would be happy to share them, and yeah, I could make this presentation. This presentation is a little large, I just realized, but some of the slides are a little graphic heavy. It's about 300 megabytes in total, but I'm sure I'd be happy to share the presentation as well as any individual photos that someone might want, or graphics. There is also a 3billionbirds.org website that has some of these graphics about the loss of birds that are available for public use there. Yeah.
Is that lost by cats, North America only? Or
US only. US only. So Canada, there's a lot fewer people in Canada, so the estimate there is lower, but still around 350 million birds killed by cats in Canada each year. And there's no estimate for Mexico, but certainly even bigger down there because there's a lot of hungry cats roaming the countryside. Yeah, let me see.
I just wanted to mention you had a slide that had the tribute of lights from 9/11.
Right.
And New York Audubon's there, so when they have the radar going, and they see birds flocking to the light, they turn them
They
off.
turn 'em
for
off,
20
yeah.
minutes, so the birds disperse.
right,
So that's
Yeah.
something new. They didn't do that
Right.
originally. First had it.
right. So there are solutions, and cities are implementing these lights out programs as well.
Yeah.
Those are making a big difference. So the birds don't crash into the buildings if the lights aren't on. So yeah, there's simple things we can do to make a big difference, reduce those sources of mortality.
With regard to the slight increase in the wetland bird, could that be related to the actions of the various forestry groups in conserving the habitat? A, B, what do you anticipate the effect is going to be of the statute that is Supreme Court on wetlands national?
Yeah, so two questions there. One is the increase in wetland birds due to resources put forth by hunters. And the second part of that was what's going to happen with the new interpretation of the Clean Water Act by the Supreme Court. Yes, on the first question, I mean, waterfowl hunters were the impetus and the drivers of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, which was first put forth in 1980 to address the declines in waterfowl that had been tracked since the 1930s. There was a lot more data going back a lot further on waterfowl populations than on other birds. And so by the 70s, they were seeing very troubling declines, and they enacted the North American Waterfowl Management Plan and helped pass the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. The North American Wetlands Conservation Act has provided in total now, since its start, which was somewhere in the mid-80s, over $1 billion of public investment matched at least 1-to-1 by private investment for wetlands conservation. So that's like protection and restoration of wetlands. So a lot of that work has been done and will be protected and maintained regardless of what the Supreme Court does, because those are sites that are in private ownership and under private management for conservation. Now, there's a lot of other wetlands out there on the landscape that are vulnerable now and are being drained. So there is real impacts to wetlands. We'll see if those numbers hold continentally going forward. It's going to be interesting. Yeah. Okay.
Zoom?
Zoom questions.
Okay.
Lots of thanks for the amazing presentation coming in. First question, how did you initiate connection with these landowners the project in Chihuahua? And is this something you can achieve here in Colorado?
Yeah, okay. So working in Mexico was a new experience for me back when I started down there on this project in 2005. We were working with the Mexican partner organizations, nonprofits, and universities there who were, like I had mentioned during my talk, the first project we done was to monitor populations across the region to understand patterns of distribution and abundance and habitat use. And so we were conducting surveys on private lands and had gone to those lands to seek permission to access those lands from the landowners. So that was our initial point of contact, was through conducting bird monitoring on these properties. Later on, after we learned where the best sites were, we maintained these relationships with the landowners and went back to some of them, not all of them, but the ones where we thought we had good opportunities to sort of move to the next phase of the work, which was helping to support them improve the land for birds. So it was first through scientific effort, and then through sort of second pass, coming back around to these landowners with a different type of program. But it's actually based on what we had been doing here in Colorado before. It's very much based on our stewardship model that we developed at Colorado Bird Observatory back in the mid-90s, specifically to address the grassland bird problem here in Colorado. So we have a long history of working with private landowners in Colorado and now throughout the Western Great Plains. And so we basically replicated that model in Mexico. Okay, there was one here in the room. Take this one.
Could you comment a bit more on invasive plants and how they affect birds? You talked a little bit about shrubs, where what figures think about trees in sandhills and Nebraska, but I've been reading more and more about the invasive plants competing with the local plants, and therefore sources of food for birds and insects that are declining rapidly.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is about the impacts of invasive plants. And what I talked about mostly in my presentation was invasive native shrubs. Shrubs like mesquite and creosote bush in the Chihuahuan Desert part of the Great Plains that are invading grasslands because of the overgrazing. But there are major threats from other non-native invasive plants, particularly invasive grasses. My experience is mostly in the Chihuahuan Desert area. One of the main invasive grasses we're concerned about there is the layman's love grass. It seems to spread very quickly away from roads into grasslands, and it tends to dominate and outcompete native grasses. And it produces a seed that is so small that most of the grassland sparrows don't eat it. And we've actually done studies on the birds to see if they will eat the seeds, catching birds like Baird sparrows and Sprague's pipits and putting them in cages for a few days and feeding them these different seed trials to see what they will eat and what they won't eat and how much they eat of each kind. And layman's love grass, they would not eat at all. And other non-native grasses like buffalo grass in the region, also they would not eat. Now there was one non-native grass that we tested them with, which is called natal grass. And that one they did eat. And these studies were mainly done on Bairds and grasshopper sparrows. So there's definitely a major concern because getting rid of these invasive grasses, we don't have a solution for that yet that is tried and true. Time for one more. I've got one here. I think he was first here.
Yes. Not a question, but just a comment. You can do this at your house as well. At the most recent house that we had, we planted a bunch of native plants. And it was amazing to see what the birds and pollinators would do in our own yard. They would visit only the native plants that we planted. So consider that at your house as well, not just the grasslands.
Definitely. Yeah.
Well, sadly, folks, we could probably go for another hour here. But our contract tells us we have to be out of here at 9. So join me in thanking Arvind. If you didn't get a chance to answer a question, reach out to me or reach out to Arvind through the Bird Conservancy, the Rockies, and we'll try to get your questions answered. So thank you all for coming out. I hope I'll see you March 14th for another great program.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Sorry for running over. I saw I had so much time left. I can relax and take some time and then something I really.
I was gonna say.